Hi and Assalamualaikum. In this video, we will explain about FMA Mineral Dust Regulation 1989.
Regulation 4. Obligation of occupier and employee. Every occupier who is engaged in any mineral process shall comply with this regulation. Every employee shall wear and use protective equipment, make full and proper use of changing room and the locker for changing and storage of protective equipment, immediately report the occupier on any defect in control equipment, and undergo any medical examination.
Regulation 6. For permissible exposure limit, it states that no employee should expose to mineral dust that contain free silica less than 1% for weight. The concentration is more than 5 mg per meter cube for respirable dust, or 10 mg per meter cube of total dust average for over 8-hour period. The second one is the permissible exposure that can be exposed to crystalline silica. Regulation 8 states that monitoring is conducted to determine the exposure level of the workers is at or above action plan. Samples should be collected from full shift or at least 7 continuous hours workers for each shift for each job classification at each work area. Regulation 10. Frequency of employee monitoring that conduct under Regulation 8. Number 1. If the exposure below action level, monitoring does not need to be repeated except that is a new or additional exposure which according to Regulation 11. Number 2. If exposure is at or above action level but below limit as specified in Regulation 6, it should be repeated at least once in every 6 months. For number 3, if exposure is above limit from specified in Regulation 6, monitoring should be repeated at least once in every 3 months. Regulation 12 states that occupier need to notify the results of monitoring to each employee within 2 weeks. They also need to notify if the employee monitoring results is exceed the limit of exposure as stated in Regulation 6. In this regulation, the water spray equipment should spray water as evenly distributed as possible so that it covers the whole surface area at the processing area. The size of the droplets is at least at the optimal size, free from any particles and acid-free, so that it can remove the airborne mineral dust better.
Regulation 17. Respiratory protection. The occupier shall, at no cost to the employee, provide an approved respiratory protective equipment to ensure its use. A. Whenever control equipment provided in pursuance to Regulation 14 does not reduce employee exposure to or below the limit specified in Regulation 6. B. Where an employee is employed in a prescribed area or doing a prescribed work. Or C. After an employee has been diagnosed to suffer from an early stage of pneumoconiosis.
Next is Regulation 20. In this regulation state that protective clothing, respiratory protective equipment and other PPE must be in a clean state and must be kept properly in a provided lockers. Cannot be taken out unless it is for use, cleaning and other necessary purpose.
Regulation 23, Medical Examination. First, an occupier shall provide or make available medical examination to an employee who exposed to crystalline silica. Second, an occupier shall arrange for employee to undergo a prescribed medical examination within 6 months from the date of this regulation take effect. Regulation 24, Prescribed Medical. The prescribed medical examination referred in Regulation 23 is a medical examination by a registered medical practitioner that include A. A chest X-ray, B. Statement of the medical, occupational and smoking history of the person examined, C. Clinical examination of the chest and pulmonary function test, D. Detailed examination for tuberculosis, and E. Any laboratory or other tests which examine registered medical practitioner deemed necessary by sound medical practice. Second, a chest X-ray specified in Sub-Regulation 1A shall be taken and read in accordance with the ILO International Classification of Radiograph of Pneumoconiosis 1980. Regulation 25, Report of Medical Examination. Registered medical practitioner shall furnish the report of the result of the examination. Regulation 26, Further Examination. If further medical examination is desirable, a medical practitioner shall notify the occupier, and the occupier shall make arrangement for the medical examination or test. Regulation 27, Duty to take protective measure where pneumoconiosis has occurred. If early stage of pneumoconiosis has occurred, medical practitioner shall notify chief inspector and the occupier. The occupier shall take immediate measure to comply with the requirement of Regulation 17 and any other directive specified in writing by the chief inspector. Let's move on to another parts. Regulation 28, Changing Room and Lockers. Employees shall be provided with protective clothing, respiratory protective equipment, and any other protective equipment in pursuance of this regulation. A conveniently accessible changing room. Regulation 29, Training. First, the occupier shall institute a training program and ensure the participation of all employees exposed to crystalline silica dust at or above the action level. Second, the occupier shall ensure that during the training program, each employee informed of the following: A. Provision of this regulation. B. Specific nature of operation which can result in exposure to mineral dust. C. The purpose, proper selection, fitting, maintenance, use, and limitation of respiratory protective equipment. D. The purpose and description of the prescribed medical examination. E. Control equipment and work procedure associated with employee's job. And the third, the training program shall be repeated at least once in 2 years. Regulation 33, Transfer of Record. First, whenever an occupier has ceased to carry on business, the successor occupier shall receive and retain all record. Second, whenever an occupier has ceased to carry on business and there is no successor occupier, the record shall be transmitted to the chief inspector. Third, at the expiration of the retention period for the record required to be maintained, the occupier shall give the chief inspector at least 3 months notice that he intends to dispose of such record, and he shall transmit those records to the chief inspector if requested to do so within that period. That's all from us. Thank you for your attention.